introduce our guests very briefly. This is, both of them are long and dear friends of mine, and our children have gone to school together, so we're going to, after we introduce them formally, we're going to dispense with titles and speak to each other directly. Our guests are Nomi Stolzenberg and David Myers. Nomi is the Nathan Chappell Professor of Law at USC, and David is the Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. They have just completed, and I've been hearing for many, many years, a fascinating book about Kiryas Joel, an American shtetl. And it is a study of an American shtetl that was built. And we're going to begin with a very, let me also say one thing about it. They've made a compelling case that this was deeply and profoundly American. And it was a shtetl that, in the words of Harry Goldman, could only happen in America, unlike any shtetl in Europe. So let's begin. That's the conclusion we're going to come to, but let's begin at the beginning. How did you guys come to this book? And how did you decide to work together?
Well, I'll start because I got involved first. In 1994, June of 1994, I was newly tenured. I was in my still early 30s. I was expecting our second daughter. And shortly before she was born, the United States Supreme Court handed down a decision at the end of that year's term, which, if I recall correctly, was front page news. It got wide public attention. It was a case in which the court struck down a law that had been enacted by the New York State legislature, authorizing the village of Kiryas Joel, which we will describe in more detail, but a village that was formed by the Satmar Hasidism. It's about an hour outside of New York City, authorizing that Satmar village to be able to create a public school district within the confines of the village. And the question presented to the Supreme Court was this law authorizing the creation of the Kiryas Joel School District constitutional, or did it violate the Establishment Clause? The Establishment Clause is the clause in the First Amendment that prohibits the state from establishing religion. And the Supreme Court struck down that law. And I had already been writing in the general area of law and religion. So like other scholars in the field, I was very intrigued by this case. I wrote a short essay then, as did many other First Amendment scholars. But my main intuition at that time was that the issues of constitutional law pertaining to the public institutions, the municipal institutions in Kiryas Joel, that this was just the tip of the iceberg. And if you really wanted to understand, A, the role that American law was playing vis-a-vis the community and its separatist institutions, and B, the fundamental question of whether the creation of these kinds of separatist local government entities was constitutional as a matter of American constitutional law, that you really had to analyze the community from the bottom up in two senses. One, from a legal point of view, much more attention needed to be paid to the private institutions and private action and the role of private law. But two, or B, you really had to have a more textured sense of how the community actually operated. That is to say, you really needed someone with the skills of a Jewish historian.
So did you know a Jewish historian?
And I happen to have one close at hand.
Well, before I let David speak, and I'm happy to keep David speaking for another 10 seconds, the First Amendment has two components to it with regard to religion, which is going to play out in our stories. Tell us the second component.
That's right. That's right. So the First Amendment begins by saying Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's what we call the Establishment Clause. And it's commonly, although controversially, understood that clause to embody the principle of separation between religion and state. And then it goes on to say, nor shall Congress, and by extension, nor shall any state or local government, make any law that abridges or rather prohibits the free exercise of religion. That's what we call the Free Exercise Clause. So the Free Exercise Clause protects the right to religious liberty, the right to the free exercise of religion. The Establishment Clause that comes before it prohibits state support for religion. And there's a tension between those two clauses.
So you turn to a Jewish historian whom you happen to know.
Yes, I mean, I should say there was a long hiatus between 1994 and when did we begin work on this book in earnest?
Yeah, I think I first got attracted to it in 2004. And so I would look over the shoulder of my brilliant wife and see that she was working on this really interesting phenomenon of religious subcommunities in America and how they find a place for themselves on the legal and political landscape. And lo and behold, there was this fascinating Jewish community that appeared on the horizon. And I'm a modern Jewish historian, and this seemed to me at first glance to be a case without precedent in the history of the Jewish diaspora in the modern age, which is to say, not just a group that established a very strong form of community in the face of all the forces that we know modernity brought down upon the Jews and others, ranging from liberal integrationism or assimilation to totalitarianism with the specter of genocide, all of which posed a threat to the strength of and integrity of a Jewish community. I knew that that this had been an incredibly defining struggle of Jews in the modern age, and here is this community that succeeds in creating a high degree of homogeneity and structure to live its very distinctive way of life. So that is the first point that's interesting. But then it's not just that it succeeded in creating a shtetl. It then, for reasons that we can elaborate, went on to become a legally recognized municipality in the state of New York. So you now have a group of a homogeneous group of Hasidic Jews belonging to the Satmar Hasidic court, who have established not just an enclave about 50 miles north of New York City, but a legally recognized municipality. That seemed too interesting to pass up, Michael.
Let me now ask you a couple of very quick questions. David, this called upon a different range of skills than you had displayed before.
Yeah.
By the way, I say that respectfully because I've read the previous work. I know your skills.
As always, my friend.
We've worked together, so I'm not.
Yeah.
Tell us how it changed you.
Yeah.
The way in which you did research.
Absolutely. So my work has tended to focus on the study of intellectual history. So I study ideas as they were articulated by largely dead people as they appear in largely published sources, though sometimes and not infrequently archival materials as well. This project required a different skill set altogether. Indeed, I brought the skills of an historian to tell the story of the evolution of the Satmar Hasidic group from its origins in Hungary in the late 19th century to the United States. But I also had to develop skills that are akin to those of an ethnographer, because we really felt that in order to understand this community, it was really necessary to grasp how it operated, more or less from within. And so a long chapter in the book is devoted to daily life in Kiryas Joel. That required many visits to the community, where I had to be a kind of ethnographer, understanding sort of the rhythm and texture of life.
So now very quickly, just explain to us what is unique about the Satmar community among the Hasidic communities, And just do it very briefly because I want to get into the substance of your book.
Yeah.
It's something different from most other groups.
Right. So first of all, the Satmar Hasidic group is, by most accounts, the largest Hasidic group in the world. And it, say, unlike its more famous cousin, the Chabad or Lubavitch Hasidic group, does not believe in expanding through outreach by going to street corners and pulling unsuspecting Jews into the fold. It rather develops through massive internal growth, through families that have anywhere between 5 to 15 kids. And what I think really distinguished Satmar amongst all of the Hasidic groups that took rise from the late 18th century was the forcefulness of its founding Rebbe, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, for whom modernity, the modern world, was itself a source of grave threat, a source of grave peril. And he believed that it was necessary not to sit back passively in the face of that threat, but to engage in combat against the forces of pollution in the world. One response to that threat was to create an enclave, a safe haven, at a remove from the seductions and allures of the city. But yet, as is often the case, Satmar brought the city with it as it created this community. It's important to note that there was an earlier precedent, and there are a couple of other examples. Before Satmar Hasidim came to Orange County, Skvera Hasidim came to Rockland County and established there a community that itself became a legally recognized municipality in 1961 called New Square. But what we see in Satmar is not just a kind of combative spirit, but almost an imperial ambition, a desire to expand out through internal growth. So the Satmar community has grown exponentially, far outpacing that of New Square, making it really the biggest such experiment that we know of in modern Jewish history. Now a community of 33,000 people, and estimates are that in 2035 it might be as many as 75,000.
What is uniquely, now I'm going to come to the core. You guys named this book An American Shtetl.
Mm-hmm.
I want to hear from both of you, what is uniquely American about this? And how the hell, if they do not integrate and they try to keep America at a distance, how do they end up at the Supreme Court? How do they end up in all sorts of legal things? And I would have to say that for those of you who have not yet read the book, and the book only came out today, we all could flunk a test at UCLA if Nomi asked us to name the 40 or 50 cases involved in that. And I'm not sure with all her brilliance that Nomi could name them either without extensive notes. But tell me from your perspective, David, and from your perspective, Nomi, what is uniquely American about this group?
Mm-hmm.
You want me to start with you?
I'll go.
Or about this achievement?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that really is the core thesis of the book, despite the fact that the Satmars themselves, as David has described, are deeply committed to resisting assimilation into the surrounding culture. So here that would be into American culture. So they themselves, their self-perception is as having an identity that is distinct from an American identity, and as abiding by a system of law, Jewish law, halakha, as interpreted by the Rebbe, that is distinct from, and to the greatest extent possible, separated from the jurisdiction of American law. So they see themselves in a certain way as un-American, although they also have historically professed deep reverence for and gratitude towards America as a place that is uniquely protective of their ability to do just that. And on the other hand, most outsiders to the community, both admirers and critics, they see it as really alien and other. And the critics in particular you know, the challenge, the legal case that went up to the Supreme Court was really expressing the point of view that was also expressed a lot in the media. There was a 60 Minutes show that really expressed, I mean, they literally said, you know, could you imagine a community like this? And they describe it and they say, not in America, Ed Bradley says. So there's this shared belief, shared by insiders and outsiders, that it's deeply at odds with America. But in fact, when you look not only at the voluminous amount of litigation that you alluded to that has emanated out of the community, and the degree to which the community has resorted to American courts of law, but also outside the context of litigation, American law, private law in particular, the law that constitutes the free market, that enables people, you know, that recognizes that everyone has the right to acquire private property and develop private property. And that's a whole other realm of law that it turns out has turned out to be facilitative of the creation of Kiryas Joel, and more generally of the kind of separatist, communitarian, enclave building impulse that the Satmars exemplify.
So I want to just pick up, Michael, if I can, on this point by saying that the United States is a religious country. The roots of the United States are rooted in the principles of religious freedom, extending back to the Puritans, who created their own religious colony in the 17th century. We mentioned in the book John Winthrop, governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who articulates this vision of creating a city on a hill, sort of imbued with spiritual and religious principles. And since that time, and somewhat counterintuitively, the United States has been home to a considerable number of these kinds of strong religious communities. We can think of the Mormons as perhaps the most successful example of that, first in Nauvoo, Illinois, and then in Salt Lake City, and then we might even say the state of Utah. Seventh-day Adventists created essentially a city of their own in the early 20th century. There's a group of followers of a Indian spiritual guru that created its own independent, autonomous city in Oregon in the 1980s called Rajneeshpuram. And in a certain sense, Kiryas Joel fits into that tradition of strong forms of religious community, some of which are actually recognized as legal municipalities. So this is one important way in which our story is an American one. There's another way, and that's sort of what Nomi was alluding to, which is a process that we call unwitting assimilation. So Satmar Hasidim are fiercely opposed to the idea that they should assimilate into American society. But as a result of existing in this country, they have absorbed legal and political principles that have become really operational in the way they do business, and have shaped the community. They have litigated much of their internal disputes in secular courts in violation.
Let's come back to that in one second. Let's talk for one moment about them as a political bloc, because they've really learned, I mean, this I learned from you, they've really learned how to use the American political system to maximize their own influence and to, as an interest group. And interest group politics is common to the United States, and they do it with, what shall we say, modestly considerable success.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, I mean, as you know well, there are sort of earlier roots to this kind of political engagement in the sort of traditional principle of Shtetl, of an intercessor designated by the community to serve as a representative of the Gentile authorities. And that system was operative in Hungary, in the formative environment in which Satmar Hasidism took rise. But it really was elevated to a new art form when Satmar Hasidim came to the United States. There was, I would say, they picked up, in a certain sense, an idea, a sense of entitlement in America. Like, you're entitled to play the game of interest group politics. You're entitled to lobby politicians. You're entitled to invite politicians to come to you to hear what the needs of the community are. And you're entitled to vote as a bloc on the instructions of the community's authority. And that they did with extraordinary discipline and effectiveness. Some would say, this is an example of a kind of, micro-totalitarianism. This is playing American interest group politics according to the rules of the game. They figured it out, they did it well, and they did it through this process of assimilating American legal and political norms in order to preserve their separatist enclave. And that's sort of the ironic dimension of this notion of an American Shtetl.
And they're a Yiddish-speaking community.
And it is a community whose lingua franca, cradle to grave, is Yiddish. And in fact, not everybody in the community, even those born in the United States, are fluent English speakers. 96.1% of the community, according to the 2020 census, says that they speak a language other than English in their home.
And they could not have done this in Israel.
They could not have done this in Israel to the extent that it has been achieved here in the United States. They certainly couldn't have done it in Europe, where there were vast concentrations of Jews. But what you have in the United States is this interesting intersection of the free exercise clause and the capacity to buy private property. The latter doesn't really exist in Israel, or it hasn't until recently. We may begin to see such enclaves develop. Some could suggest that B'nai Brak is itself a template of it, but the degree of exclusivity of this one community, Satmar Hasidim, 99%, more than 99% of Kiryas Joel, not just dwelling in sort of blessed isolation, but recognized as a legal municipality.
And if I'll just add to that, you ask, could this happen in Israel? Well, in some, it depends what the it is, right? Could there be formed by the Satmars or similar groups? Could the Satmars or similar groups form their own municipalities, have their own municipalities in Israel? Well, they could, but the process by which that would occur would be a top-down process, right? Insofar as something like that happens in Israel, it would happen really by virtue of government action. The government, and this is true of many countries, not only Israel, a much more top-down approach that it sort of officially recognizes the existence of a subgroup and says, we're going to allocate you land and we're going to confer upon you certain governmental powers. That doesn't happen in the United States, right? The Establishment Clause prohibits that kind of top-down official recognition of religious groups and conferral of governmental powers on them. So you would think that can't happen here. But in fact, at least as robust, not only private communities, but as we see here, private communities that can then exercise the power of the block vote to incorporate themselves as local governments, that happens from the bottom up. That's what we call communitarianism from the bottom up. And that is what is so uniquely American about the phenomenon. And, it's essentially an expression of the free market, of capitalism.
Now, Nomi, David said something that would sound enormously shocking to anybody who looked at Satmar from the outside, which is that they brought their internal disputes to American courts.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably, they should have gone to rabbinic authority.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, when American courts, tell us how American courts deal with the struggle for their
Right.
internal problems. And let's have David, but David, 2 minutes, because I'm trying to get, I want to get most of the content that we can in this. David, tell us the 4 examples of internal disputes.
Oh, well, Nomi is the expert on disputes, but I will just, and she'll talk about that, but I do just want to say that there's a longstanding principle of not appealing to Arkaot Shel Goyim, to Gentile courts, which was completely shattered at a certain point when the community began to fracture. And that's sort of the essential preface to what Nomi's about to describe. After the death of the charismatic founding rabbi, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, there basically has been a succession struggle in the community from that point, August 1979. The person who succeeded him, Moshe Teitelbaum, did not have the authority or charisma of his uncle. And then Moshe Teitelbaum essentially divided the Satmar Empire into 2, giving one half to his eldest son and another half to his third son. It's at that point that we began to see.
Also in a male-centered universe.
In a completely male-centered universe.
But the widow of Joel Teitelbaum had considerable fega.
Yeah, we could get into the incredible role played by the Rebbitzin of the founding Satmar Rebbe, known as Alta Feiga, who became a symbolic and, in a certain sense, political leader of those who believe themselves to be the truest followers of Rabbi Joel, who came to be known as the B'nai or B'nai Joel, the sons of Joel. But
So
what I wanted to say to set the stage.
Nomi, because we got to.
Yeah. So you have, from the time of Joel's death, the beginning of dissident factions, which open up the way to the appeal to Gentile courts.
And after Moshe divided it between his 2 sons, who seemed to be the war between Williamsburg and Kiryas Joel.
Right. Mm-hmm. Rabbi Aaron, the eldest son in Kiryas Joel, Rabbi Zalman Leib, the third son in Williamsburg. And with that,
You gave them cute names. We have to tell us the cute names, Tommy.
The cute name, what of which? The Zalis and the Aronis? Yes.
The Aronis and the Zalis.
Yeah, so the followers of Aaron are known as the Aronis. The followers of Zalman are known as the Zalis. And the disputation between them, which leads to, a decade of, myriad lawsuits that are, it took me years to disentangle. That's really, the 4th phase of these kinds of internal disputes. So as you say, the amount of litigation in civil courts is truly astounding. First of all, because of this ostensible and I think sincere commitment on the part of both sides to the disputes, to the principle that internal disputes should never be brought to Gentile courts, right? So why do they end up violating this deep-seated principle? That really begins, you asked for 4 examples. So the first example, the first such case, occurs in 1990 when a man by the name of Joseph Waldman, a very outspoken internal dissident. This is long before the schism between the Zalis and the Aronis emerges. This is in the first years after the death of the Rebbe, when, as you have just discussed, the widow Feiga and her supporters, they're really not accepting the legitimacy of the immediate successor. And they are responded to harshly. So in 1990, and this becomes very much intertwined with what I referred to earlier, the creation of the public school district, that sort of provides Feiga's mention, as they are called, this still relatively small but burgeoning group of dissidents, a sort of another grounds for objecting to the leadership. And in response, Joseph Waldman's children are expelled from the yeshiva and from the girls' school. And that is really sort of the principal enforcement tool that the community has. If you don't abide by the community's regulations, your children will be expelled from school. And in 1990, when this happens, Waldman places a fateful phone call to a local civil rights attorney by the name of Michael Sussman, who's a Harvard Law School trained civil rights attorney who had attained some notoriety litigating the Yonkers housing and school desegregation suit. Some of you might have seen him and the case depicted in the miniseries called Show Me a Hero. And he places that call and asks for Sussman's help in getting his children reinstated in school. And that actually leads to a local court summoning the Rebbe and his son Aaron. They are threatened with being held in contempt of court. They have to appear in court. The dissidents never cease going to court trying to challenge the village. About 5 years later, a contest, it sort of grows out of a zoning dispute. By this point in time, the dissidents are much more numerous. They're trying to create their own set of parallel institutions. They're trying to create their own grand synagogue. And so the village slaps them with building code citations. And that leads to a huge lawsuit and actually a trial, which is the first time in which, and represented by the aforementioned Michael Sussman, the dissidents accuse the village of violating their civil rights and of violating the Establishment Clause. They call it in one of their lawsuits a theocracy. That suit ends up getting settled. Just very quickly, there are subsequently eviction proceedings brought against the widow Fega. That's another really interesting site of litigation. And last but not least, the Aronis and Zalis in 2000 each claims to be the rightful president of the board of the Williamsburg congregation, and each stages its own elections for a new board, and each claims that its election slate is the legitimate one, and they repair to courts all over the state, from Kings County, where Brooklyn is, to Orange County.
And
It's
Nomi,
impossible to summarize and briefly.
now talk for 1 second as a lawyer. What is the difficulty that this poses to the law, to American law?
Well, right. So what is
a fascinating part of your book?
Yeah. So what is so interesting? You have two mysteries, or right? You have the first is, why did a community that is committed to the principle that you shouldn't litigate in Gentile courts, why did it do just that? The counterpart to that is the American courts want nothing to do with this dispute. The last thing in the world they want to do is get dragged into internal disputes over who is the real leader of the community, who is the real owner of the community's considerable assets, and so on and so forth. And indeed, there is a legal doctrine that essentially says, this is based on interpretations of both of the religion clauses we mentioned. The Supreme Court has long held that civil courts may not adjudicate religious disputes. They may not adjudicate internal disputes, over who is the real leader of a church or a synagogue, or who is the real owner of church property, and so on, insofar as those questions turn on competing views about the religious group's theology. But on the other hand, it is permissible for courts to adjudicate disputes over church property, or here's synagogue property, or who the real leader is, if they don't turn on theological principles, and if this is a community that has itself decided to have those matters determined by secular law. So the courts tried their darndest to stay out of these disputes. And after years of litigation, these cases ended in the formal declaration. The court says, we have decided not to decide. We are not going to adjudicate this dispute. And here I had to learn that you don't just look at the final decision. You have to look at what we now call the shadow docket. You have to look at the pretrial orders and the interim orders that the courts made. What you come to realize is that very, very early on in the litigation, the courts, in fact, made so-called temporary decisions about who could exercise control of the synagogue pending the outcome of the litigation. And the court sided with one side rather than the other. And that actually effectively upheld one party as against the other.
Let me now ask you to go a little bit beyond in a couple of minutes beyond the book itself. What did the COVID epidemic or pandemic? What problems did this pose also to Satmar? Let me just answer two questions that have been posed in the chat, just so we can go through it. Number one, very importantly, yes, Satmar is anti the government of Israel and anti-Zionist to the extreme. Okay, and number two, I believe David has answered the question of the number of people. And the one thing we know about the community is there will be more tomorrow than there were yesterday, and more next year than there were last year. And David said it can go up to about 70,000 in about another 14 years. But what did COVID present to this community? And there was a major case, Spring case involved in this.
Yeah, a challenge and an opportunity, I would say. The challenge was twofold. One, to the way of life of the community, because quarantine and lockdown pose really distinct and unique challenges to a community such as Satmar, which depends on daily congregation for the purposes of prayer, celebration, and mourning. It's not a theoretical proposition. It's essential to constitute 10 men in order to have a prayer quorum. That prayer quorum is indispensable to the essential obligatory daily act that men in the community must perform. So this produced, in the first instance, a sense of tremendous resentment towards the government, including towards longstanding friends of the Satmar community, such as former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who had been a close ally of the community. But when he imposed restrictions, a lockdown, and closed schools, this posed unique challenges. So first, the inability to pray regularly in as part of the community, shutting down of schools, which meant that the tons of kids in the community, 60% of the community is under the age of 18, huge numbers of kids in school. Now everybody is at home in small apartments, crammed together, placing incredible burdens and stress on the family. And this led to a new degree, a kind of new chapter in the political assimilation, if you will, of Satmar, because Satmar Hasidim and Haredi, traditionally observant Jews, often known as ultra-Orthodox, began to take to the streets and protest and say, this is not only unacceptable to us, it's un-American. It's a violation of our religious liberties. That revealed...
They didn't say it was anti-Semitic.
They did say it was anti-Semitic. Yeah, they did say it was anti-Semitic. They did say it was anti-Semitic, but they also said it's un-American. And that is, another way in which this is a decidedly American shtetl. In that regard, they joined forces with many other Christian conservatives who are protesting this moment as a violation of their religious liberties. At a moment in time, if we sort of trace the arc of history, we can see, extending back to just about the time that Kiryas Joel was created in 1977, legally incorporated in 1977. Around that time, the moral majority was created, 1979. a movement that was committed to really eroding the boundary between religion and state and saying religion belongs in the public square. There is an interesting confluence and at some points alliance between Jewish religious conservatives and Christian religious conservatives. In 2020, that alliance becomes much tighter. There's protest, there's litigation, there's a new, I would say, audacity, and it's not entirely coincidental that there's a very significant political shift that we also see, which is that in 2020, over 99% of Kiryas Joel that voted in the presidential election voted for Donald Trump. Compare that to 2016, 55% of Kiryas Joel voted for Donald Trump. So you see an astonishing shift as part of this new insistence on religious liberties that was so important in the community and in the conservative religious community more generally.
I appreciate it. I want to thank Professor Nomi Stolzenberg and Professor David Myers.